The cathedral doors stood open beneath a pale London sky that seemed undecided between spring brightness and lingering winter chill, and into that trembling light rolled carriage after carriage bearing the careful elegance of a society that never forgot an audience watched it even when it pretended not to look at itself. Silk brushed stone steps. Footmen bowed. Names of consequence passed between gloved hands like currency. Yet before the bride appeared, before the organ stirred the air into solemn anticipation, there stood already among the guests a young woman whose presence alone unsettled the balance of the day. She had not been expected to come. Indeed, many had hoped she would not. Yet she stood there with composed stillness beside a marble pillar veined faintly with rose, her gloved fingers folded lightly together, her bonnet modest rather than fashionable, her expression calm enough to suggest either courage or exhaustion. Those who recognized her looked quickly away with the polite haste reserved for reminders of discomfort. Those who did not recognize her were instructed within moments by whispering companions. Her name passed quietly between lips that shaped sympathy without offering it. She had once been expected to stand nearer the altar. Not today as a bride, but once. Years earlier, when promises had been exchanged in gardens rather than sanctuaries, when admiration had been spoken openly enough to be believed yet cautiously enough to be denied later, she had been considered, if not formally engaged, then certainly destined. Invitations had once arrived addressed to her with assumptions of permanence. Walks had been taken beneath supervision that softened with familiarity. Futures had been hinted at in phrases delicate enough to vanish when questioned. Then those hints had dissolved. And so had she. Not entirely, of course. A woman of good upbringing could not disappear without scandal, and scandal had never quite attached itself to her name strongly enough to destroy it. Instead, she had endured the more refined cruelty of uncertainty. People remembered something had happened. People remembered something had been withdrawn. People remembered something she had never explained. It was astonishing how effectively silence could wound a reputation when repeated often enough. Her invitation to the wedding had arrived 3 weeks earlier. Cream paper. Gold edging. Unmistakably deliberate. No one had been deceived by its courtesy. The bride's family was known for precision rather than generosity, and precision rarely produced accidents. To invite her had been an act performed with intention so quiet it almost resembled kindness, which made refusal impossible without appearing dramatic. Acceptance had therefore been her only defense. Attendance had become her only dignity. Now she stood among witnesses. And they were watching. The bride entered at last beneath a drift of white blossoms carried by girls scarcely old enough to understand ceremony but old enough to enjoy spectacle. Her veil shimmered faintly as though it held light rather than lace. The groom turned toward her with an expression practiced carefully enough to appear sincere from every angle. Applause softened itself respectfully into silence. Music rose. Heads bowed. Only once did he look toward the pillar. Only once. Yet it was enough. He inclined his head with a politeness that suggested acquaintance rather than history, gratitude rather than apology, and dismissal rather than recognition. Anyone observing the exchange might have believed he greeted a distant cousin or a neighbor's daughter whose presence required acknowledgement but not memory. Those who knew more lowered their voices still further. "How charitable of her to attend," someone whispered. "How determined," another replied. Or how foolish. She did not turn. She did not move. Yet her fingers tightened once against each other, then released again as though reminding themselves they belonged to her still. She listened to the vows with attention so steady it seemed reverent, though nothing in her expression betrayed devotion. Perhaps she listened simply because leaving would have confirmed what others already believed, that she had come for reasons less dignified than endurance. When the ceremony ended, movement resumed with relieved eagerness. Guests rose. Conversation returned. Flowers were gathered for the procession toward the reception rooms prepared beyond the cloisters. It was then, amid the soft confusion of rearranged chairs and redirected steps, that the bride's sister approached her with smiling certainty and placed into her hands a cluster of lilies intended not for guests but for attendants waiting near the aisle. "How kind of you to assist," the young lady said brightly. A servant reached forward almost immediately to retrieve them. "Not required, miss," he corrected gently, though not gently enough. Several observers noticed. Several more pretended not to. Color touched her cheek for the first time that morning, not deeply enough to betray distress yet unmistakably enough to satisfy curiosity. She returned the flowers without protest. She inclined her head without defense. She stepped back exactly 1 pace farther from the center of the aisle than she had stood before. Society approved such adjustments. It called them understanding. Beyond the shifting guests, however, Another figure had remained still throughout the ceremony, throughout the whispers, throughout the careful correction. He stood near the shadowed curve of a pillar opposite hers, tall enough that no one entirely obscured him yet restrained enough that few dared stare openly. His mourning black coat contrasted sharply with the brightness of wedding silk, and though he spoke to no one, others spoke around him with respectful caution. He had watched everything. Not with curiosity. With attention. When the congregation began to move toward the cloister doors, a passing gentleman turned abruptly, his sleeve brushing a glass from a tray carried too hastily between chairs. Red wine spilled across her gloves like a careless accusation. Someone laughed too quickly. Someone apologized too late. Someone remarked that accidents were unavoidable in crowded ceremonies. Before she could withdraw her hands, another gloved hand extended a folded handkerchief of fine linen toward her. "Madam," said a quiet voice beside her, "permit me." She looked up, startled less by the offer than by the certainty with which it was made, and met the steady gaze of the silent observer who had watched the entire morning unfold without once speaking aloud. Miss Eliza Harrowby had not expected her name to sound unfamiliar when spoken by a stranger, yet there was something in the quiet certainty of the gentleman's voice that suggested not discovery but recollection, as though he had been waiting some time for the proper moment to address her without intrusion. She accepted the handkerchief because refusal would have drawn attention, and attention had already followed her through the cathedral like a reluctant companion she could neither dismiss nor outrun. The linen absorbed the spreading stain across her gloves with dignified efficiency, and when she lifted her eyes again she found that the gentleman remained beside her without impatience, as though assisting her had been not an impulse but a decision made long before the accident itself. "You are very kind, sir," she said carefully, aware that kindness within such walls was rarely offered without consequence. "Only observant," he replied, his tone neither apologetic nor presumptuous but exact. Before she could answer further, several guests passing behind them altered their path with visible discretion, granting the gentleman space with the instinctive respect society reserved for rank too elevated to be mistaken. Eliza followed their glances and understood at once why his presence carried such authority. The silver device at his sleeve bore a crest unmistakable to anyone accustomed to London circles. The Duke of Ashbourne was not merely distinguished, he was unavoidably significant. His reputation preceded him wherever he walked, though rarely through conversation. He was known for restraint rather than charm, influence rather than display, and a reserve so complete that even gossip respected its boundaries. That such a man should address her directly, and before witnesses, altered the balance of the morning more surely than the spilled wine had done. "You should not remain standing here," he said quietly, as guests continued to drift toward the cloisters where the wedding breakfast awaited its audience. "I have not yet discovered where I am expected to remain," she answered with gentle composure, unwilling to pretend she possessed certainty she did not feel. "Then allow me to correct the omission," he said, extending his arm as though the arrangement had already been agreed between them. She hesitated only long enough to recognize the courage required to accept such an invitation before others who watched closely enough to measure its meaning. His sleeve was offered not as courtesy alone but as protection, and protection publicly given could never be mistaken for indifference. She placed her hand lightly upon his arm, aware that the gesture itself had already begun to rearrange the afternoon. They entered the reception hall together. Conversation shifted almost immediately, not because they spoke but because they did not. The Duke guided her toward the central table reserved for those whose presence shaped the tone of the gathering rather than followed it, and several ladies already seated there rose instinctively, uncertain whether they ought to remain or withdraw. The hesitation lasted only a moment before the Duke addressed them with calm assurance that required no explanation. "Miss Harrowby will join us," he said. It was not a request. Eliza felt every gaze in the room measure her position anew as she accepted the chair he indicated, though she suspected none observed the detail that followed immediately afterward. Having placed her there, he did not reclaim his own seat but remained standing beside her, his gloved hand resting lightly against the carved back of the chair as though he intended to remain its sentinel. "Your Grace," murmured a gentleman nearby with cautious curiosity, "you are not seated." "I am exactly where I intend to be," he answered. The simplicity of his reply altered the air more effectively than any declaration might have done. Conversation resumed, though more carefully now, each sentence shaped with awareness that the afternoon no longer belonged entirely to its hosts. Eliza felt her pulse steady gradually beneath the protection of his quiet presence, not because she understood his purpose, but because she understood his certainty. Across the table the bride watched them. Her smile remained faultless. Her attention did not. During the first course, a servant approached Eliza with the hesitation of one accustomed to instructions that shifted without warning. He bent slightly and whispered that a place had been prepared for her elsewhere, nearer the far end of the hall among guests whose names carried less consequence than their obedience. Before she could respond, the Duke spoke. "The arrangement is unnecessary," he said calmly. The servant withdrew immediately. No further explanation was required. Later, as glasses were raised to honor the newly married couple, Eliza discovered that her own had been filled with water rather than wine, a detail so small it might have passed unnoticed had the Duke not exchanged it himself for another without comment. The gesture lasted no longer than a breath, yet its intention was unmistakable. He did not permit her to appear diminished. When the toasts concluded and guests began to disperse toward the adjoining gardens, she prepared to withdraw quietly, believing she had already received more consideration than the afternoon could reasonably offer. Instead, the Duke inclined his head toward her with deliberate gravity. "You will permit my carriage to convey you home," he said. "That would not be proper," she answered, though she did not step away. "On the contrary," he replied softly, "it will be necessary." She could not determine whether the necessity belonged to her comfort or his intention, yet before she could protest further a small parcel was placed discreetly into her hands by one of his attendants waiting near the doorway. The wrapping was simple, the seal unmistakable, and when she looked toward him in quiet confusion he met her gaze with composed assurance. "No lady," he said, "should depart a celebration diminished." The parcel remained unopened in Miss Eliza Harrowby's lap for the entire journey home, though the carriage that conveyed her through the dimming London streets belonged unmistakably to the Duke of Ashbourne and therefore carried with it an expectation she could neither ignore nor easily accept. The interior smelled faintly of polished leather and winter oranges preserved too carefully to be seasonal, and she sat opposite him in composed silence, conscious that the distance between them measured less than 3 feet yet seemed filled with implications far wider than the city through which they traveled. He had offered the carriage without requesting permission twice, and she had accepted without explaining why refusal had suddenly seemed more conspicuous than compliance. At last, when the rattle of wheels softened as they turned toward quieter streets where lamplight stretched longer shadows across narrow pavements, she rested her gloved hand lightly upon the parcel and spoke with careful steadiness. "Your Grace has shown me consideration beyond any expectation I could reasonably claim." "I have shown you only what was already owed," he replied. "Owed," she repeated, uncertain whether the word belonged to courtesy or obligation. "Yes," he said, not withdrawing the claim. His certainty unsettled her more than extravagance would have done, because extravagance might have been dismissed as impulse, while certainty implied memory. "I fear," she continued after a moment, "that your kindness has already occasioned comment." "It has," he answered calmly. She looked toward him in surprise. "You do not deny it?" "I seldom deny what I intend," he replied. The carriage slowed briefly at a crossing where a vendor's lantern flickered against rain-darkened cobbles, and in that shifting light she saw more clearly the composure with which he regarded her, not as a gentleman offering polite assistance to a lady in temporary embarrassment, but as a man who had already chosen his position and merely awaited its recognition. "I cannot allow my circumstances to inconvenience you," she said quietly. "They do not inconvenience me," he answered. "They may injure your reputation." "My reputation," he said, "is not so fragile." She hesitated, then spoke more softly still. "Mine is." At this he leaned slightly forward, not in urgency but in emphasis, as though her admission required correction rather than sympathy. "Your reputation," he said, "has suffered from silence rather than truth." The words startled her into stillness. "No one," she answered after a moment, "has ever suggested otherwise." "I have," he replied. She lifted her eyes fully to his then, unable to conceal her surprise. "You have never spoken to me before today." "I have not spoken," he agreed. The carriage continued through the narrowing twilight, its wheels echoing faintly against shuttered shop fronts, while his answer lingered between them with the weight of something not yet explained but already significant. "You imply knowledge you cannot possess," she said gently, though not without curiosity. "I possess precisely the knowledge I require," he answered. She considered him carefully now, not as a stranger of rank but as a witness whose attention had preceded their acquaintance. "How long," she asked at last, "have you supposed yourself acquainted with my circumstances?" "Since the afternoon they first altered," he replied. The simplicity of the answer unsettled her more deeply than its meaning. "That was years ago," she said. "Yes." "You observed it?" "I prevented what I could." Her breath paused. "I do not understand." There was a conversation, he continued quietly, in a conservatory at Haverton House, which you were not intended to overhear but did. She stared at him. No one else knew I had been there. I knew, he said. How? I was present before either of you entered. The memory returned to her at once with the vividness of preserved humiliation. Voices behind glass palms, promises withdrawn with cautious phrasing, explanations offered not to her but to another man who advised prudence rather than loyalty. She had believed herself alone in hearing the quiet dismissal that followed her departure from the room. She had believed the moment belonged only to her disappointment. You heard everything? She whispered. Everything that mattered, he answered. And you said nothing. I spoke afterward. To whom? To him. The carriage slowed again as they approached her street, yet neither of them marked the change. What did you say? She asked. That he would regret treating Constancy as inconvenience, he replied. She could not help the faint astonishment that touched her voice then. He did not appear to regret it. He altered his conduct, the Duke answered. He married another. He did not compromise you further. The distinction struck her with unexpected force. I had believed, she said slowly, that silence preserved my dignity. It preserved his comfort, he corrected gently. For a moment neither spoke. Outside, rain began at last, falling softly against the carriage windows like a patient interruption long delayed. I cannot imagine, she said at last, why your grace should have concerned himself with such matters. I admired your restraint, he answered simply. No one admires restraint, she said with quiet disbelief. I do. The carriage stopped before her modest lodging, yet he did not signal for the door to open. You have misunderstood my position, she said carefully. I am not accustomed to protection. You should be, he replied. She gathered the parcel more firmly in her hands, aware suddenly that the gift it contained could no longer be mistaken for politeness alone. I do not know how to accept what I do not yet understand, she confessed. Then allow me to make it clearer tomorrow, he said gently. Morning arrived with a restraint peculiar to London in early spring, when sunlight entered drawing rooms cautiously, as though aware that revelation must proceed more gently than rumor, and Miss Eliza Harrowby stood beside the narrow window of her modest lodging watching carriages pass below with the uneasy awareness that by midday her own name might again be passing between them. The parcel the Duke of Ashbourne had placed into her hands the previous afternoon lay opened upon the small escritoire behind her, its contents no longer mysterious yet no less astonishing. A pair of ivory kid gloves fitted so precisely to her hands that she could not mistake their intention, accompanied only by his crest impressed upon a card whose silence conveyed more than explanation might have achieved. She had worn them that morning. Not as ornament. As acknowledgment. Before she could persuade herself that the previous day's events might still retreat politely into misunderstanding, a servant arrived bearing a sealed envelope edged in discreet silver rather than gold, the distinction itself announcing a private rather than ceremonial purpose. She broke the seal with steady fingers, though her pulse betrayed anticipation she had not permitted herself to name. Her Grace the Duchess of Ashbourne requests the honor of Miss Harrowby's presence this evening at the Spring Assembly. The wording surprised her more than the invitation. The Duchess had died nearly a decade earlier. There was no Duchess, which meant the invitation belonged unmistakably to the Duke himself. He had summoned her not merely to attend but to be seen. London would understand at once what such an invitation implied. Declining would confirm embarrassment. Accepting would invite speculation. Yet uncertainty had governed too much of her life already, and she found that morning she possessed less patience for hesitation than she had the day before. By afternoon she had selected the simplest of her evening gowns, pale gray rather than white, elegant without presumption, and when the Duke's carriage arrived precisely at the hour announced she entered it without permitting herself the refuge of reconsideration. His residence stood illuminated with a brilliance that seemed almost ceremonial rather than festive, chandeliers already burning above tall windows that reflected twilight like captured constellations. Servants moved with quiet efficiency shaped not by haste but by expectation. This was not merely a gathering. It was an announcement. When he received her at the entrance to the ballroom he bowed not with the distant courtesy he had shown the previous day but with deliberate warmth that acknowledged her presence before witnesses who had gathered early enough to observe every detail. You have come, he said simply. You requested it, she answered. I intended more than a request. I suspected as much. His expression altered then, not into amusement but into something steadier. Then allow me to justify your confidence. The musicians began before she could reply, and conversation faltered across the room as he extended his arm to her once again, though this time there could be no misunderstanding of the gesture's significance. He did not escort her toward a chair or a discreet corner. He led her directly to the center of the ballroom where the first dance would begin. No introduction followed. None was required. The first set belonged traditionally to hosts, newly married couples, or those whose rank commanded precedence beyond dispute. By stepping forward with her he altered expectation itself. Gentlemen paused mid-sentence. Ladies lowered their fans with identical motions of astonishment. The air seemed to rearrange around them as though the entire assembly leaned nearer without moving. "You must not do this," she murmured as they took their places opposite one another beneath the chandelier's steady brilliance. "I must," he answered. "They will misunderstand. They will understand precisely what I intend." "And what is that?" "That your place is beside me." The music began. He did not look away from her once. Each measured step carried them through figures that had governed English society for generations. Yet tonight the choreography seemed less formal than declarative, each turn drawing attention rather than diffusing it, each pause marking not hesitation but certainty. She felt the awareness of every gaze upon them and discovered, with unexpected clarity, that she no longer feared those gazes as she had feared them the previous morning. Halfway through the set a familiar voice interrupted the delicate pattern of violins. "Miss Harrowby." She turned. Her former admirer stood at the edge of the floor beside his new bride, his expression arranged carefully enough to resemble courtesy without concealing discomfort. "I trust you are well," he continued. "I am entirely so," she answered. He hesitated, then added with strained politeness, "London has spoken much since yesterday." "Yes," the Duke replied before she could respond further, his tone calm enough to silence even curiosity. "London often speaks more than it understands." The gentleman inclined his head slightly, uncertain whether to withdraw or persist. "I had hoped," he said cautiously, "to assure Miss Harrowby that no misunderstanding remains between us." "There never was misunderstanding," the Duke answered evenly. "Only discourtesy." The word settled across the room like a decisive stroke of ink. No one spoke. The bride's fan stilled in her hand. The gentleman flushed visibly but attempted composure. "I intended no injury," he said. "Intent rarely repairs consequence," the Duke replied. He turned then toward Eliza with quiet deliberation. "Miss Harrowby," he said clearly enough for those nearest them to hear, "may I request the honor of calling tomorrow, with intention?" The question he had spoken beneath the chandelier did not fade when the music ended, nor when the assembly resumed its careful motion around them, nor even when Miss Eliza Harrowby returned at last to her modest lodging in the quiet hours before dawn, carrying with her the unmistakable certainty that her life had altered not gradually, but decisively, before witnesses who would never again pretend uncertainty about her position. London had heard him. London would remember him. And London, which had once studied her silence as though it were confession, would now be forced to study his intention instead. Morning arrived sooner than she expected, though perhaps she had not truly slept. Her maid entered with a composure strained by curiosity she attempted politely to disguise, bearing not one letter but 3, each sealed with crests whose owners had not written to Miss Harrowby in many months. Invitations, inquiries, and assurances of acquaintance had begun arriving before breakfast, their language cautious yet unmistakably altered. Society did not apologize when it corrected itself. It simply rearranged its memory. She set the letters aside unopened. Only one caller mattered. Precisely at 11, the sound of a carriage stopping before her lodging caused the maid to hurry to the window, then return with eyes widened beyond restraint. "Your Grace," she whispered, as though the title itself required discretion. Eliza did not answer immediately. She had prepared herself for this visit, yet preparation could not quiet the awareness that she was about to accept or refuse a future not merely respectable but irrevocable. When the Duke entered her drawing-room moments later, he removed his gloves slowly, not from hesitation but from deliberation, as though each gesture acknowledged the seriousness of the conversation he intended to complete. "I hope," he said gently, "that I have not arrived too soon." "You have arrived precisely as you promised," she answered. "I am relieved," he said, though nothing in his expression suggested uncertainty had ever troubled him. He did not sit until she did, and even then he remained composed rather than ceremonious, as though he had come not to persuade but to confirm what he believed already understood. "I spoke last evening with intention," he said. "Yes," she answered quietly. "I wish there to be no doubt." There was none. He inclined his head slightly at her reply, acknowledging not victory but agreement. "I will not disguise my purpose now," he continued. "I ask you to allow me to offer you my protection openly, permanently, and without reservation." She studied him carefully before answering, not because she questioned his sincerity, but because sincerity alone had once been insufficient to secure her trust. "You speak of protection," she said. "Do you speak also of affection?" His reply did not come immediately, yet when it came it carried no uncertainty. "I speak of respect first," he said. "Affection has followed it longer than I permitted myself to acknowledge." She drew breath slowly, aware that he had not spoken the word lightly. "You have known me scarcely at all," she said. "I have known your character," he answered. "Society values acquaintance. I value constancy." "And if society objects?" "It has already objected," he replied calmly. "It will adjust." She could not help the faint smile that touched her expression then, not of amusement but of recognition. "You intend to alter London itself," she said. "No," he answered gently. "I intend to alter only your position within it." Silence followed, though not an uneasy silence. It carried instead the quiet gravity of decision forming itself without haste. At last she rose and crossed the small distance between them, not with theatrical courage but with the steadiness she had preserved through every humiliation she had endured before his intervention. "I accept," she said. He did not speak at once. Instead, he bowed his head slightly, as though the moment required acknowledgment deeper than triumph. "You honor me," he said. Word traveled with astonishing speed. By afternoon the announcement had crossed drawing rooms and luncheon tables alike, carrying with it astonishment first, then admiration, and finally certainty. Some doubted the wisdom of his choice. Others admired its boldness. Yet none questioned its reality. A duke's intention required no confirmation beyond his presence, and his presence that evening at a garden reception hosted by one of London's oldest families ensured there would be no ambiguity remaining. Guests gathered beneath pale blossoms newly opened to the spring air, their fragrance drifting lightly above conversations that faltered when the Duke entered the terrace with Miss Harrowby beside him. No introduction followed. None was necessary. They walked together with a composure so natural that observers understood instinctively what rumor had only begun to suggest. When he paused at the center of the lawn, conversation ceased entirely. "Eliza," he said quietly, though the silence carried his voice farther than he intended. She turned toward him. Those nearest them watched with stillness sharpened by anticipation. Those farther away leaned nearer without realizing they had moved. Society had once studied her embarrassment with equal attention. Now it studied her vindication. "I have asked your consent," he continued. "Permit me now to ask your hand." Before she could answer, he did what no one present expected a duke to do. He knelt. The gesture transformed astonishment into reverence. Gasps rose around them, yet none disturbed the clarity of his voice as he spoke again. "I ask before those who once doubted you," he said, "so that none may doubt you again." For a moment she could not speak. The garden blurred slightly before her, not from uncertainty but from the sudden understanding that the years she had spent defending herself without allies had ended entirely in that single act of public devotion. He had not merely chosen her. He had restored her before witnesses who would carry the memory of that moment long after their own assumptions had faded. "Yes," she said at last. He rose then, not quickly but with quiet certainty, and when he offered her his arm again she accepted it not as refuge but as partnership. Around them conversation resumed slowly, altered forever in tone. No one whispered now. No one speculated. They observed instead with the respectful curiosity reserved for events that reshape expectation itself. Weeks later, when her carriage passed once more along the same cathedral steps where she had stood alone beneath spring light that had seemed uncertain whether to welcome her, the memory returned not with pain but with clarity. She paused only briefly before entering the waiting carriage beside him, aware that those who had once watched her with curiosity now watched her with admiration they did not attempt to conceal. Some women, London would later say, were diminished by society's judgment. Some endured it. And once, beneath lilies and chandeliers and the steady courage of a single man's voice, one woman had been claimed so completely that even memory itself learned to speak her name differently thereafter.